So let's start our chat going and let me know. Do you dismiss compliments? When people say something nice to you, do you actually kind of push it away a bit? So I'd love to hear from those of you who might do that. So Tammy 50-50 and Lynn, you don't accept it. Yeah, so a lot of people I think struggle with accepting compliments, particularly when you grow up with ADHD. And part of the reason it's challenging is because, a lot of people have trouble really hearing something good. Because after years of hearing about your deficiencies or experiencing challenges that other people may or may not have experienced, it's hard to take in what someone's saying that's kind of positive. And you might walk around with a persistent feeling that you're just not good enough. When good things happen in your life, perhaps you wonder if you truly deserve them, or the validation or the acknowledgement that's coming with them. So if any of these statements are true for you, you probably struggle with imposter syndrome. So I'm curious, when someone gives you positive feedback, what do you say back to them? Do you say thank you? Do you say, oh, it's not a big deal? Do you minimize it? What do you do when someone says something that's, really acknowledging something that you did well, or absolutely, is grateful for something that you did? So Tammy says, absolutely, I reframe my thoughts. Oh, yes. And Lynn says, kind of not good enough, very uncomfortable. So imposter syndrome reflects feeling like a fraud or a phony. It comes from a sense of insecurity that's either in your awareness or hovering just below the surface. Imposter syndrome doesn't actually occur overnight. Rather, it takes years of receiving criticism and experiencing judgments for somebody to develop this core sense of deficiency that can really eat away at you. And this deficiency, based on evaluations, exclusion, or hostility from others as you matured, lies at the heart of imposter syndrome. It can foster, this kind of insecurity can foster a sort of pervasive self-doubt that you don't deserve any of the accolades you receive. And imposter syndrome is also related to perfectionism. Since you're not perfect and you can never achieve perfection, then somehow you must be fundamentally flawed. And sadly, for so many folks, no matter how much success they seem to have in their lives, it doesn't lessen this wound. And I'm going to share with you now a downloadable for you to go to and check out. That's a gift for you about perfectionism, because perfectionism and imposter syndrome are so closely linked. Now, many neurodivergent adults, teens, or kids have been judged unfavorably against neurotypical standards, and you may have internalized these opinions. What kinds of standards do you think that you've been judged against? If you want to put those up in the chat, that would be great. Lynn, you said that sometimes you minimize when someone says something nice to you, or is in terms of like feedback about what you did, and you're not sure if they're sincere. And that that question about sincerity can be really tough, because then you don't know who to believe or who not to believe. So I'm curious, what types of neurotypical standards do you feel like you've been compared to unfavorably? Because imposter syndrome is really the domain of your inner critic. It's the voice that spews negativity about being simply different, thinking differently, being an outside the box thinker or doer. You're just like the rest of us, an imperfectly perfect human. But this voice, this inner critic, adds a toxic layer of insecurity. You walk around anxious that someone will discover this incompetence that you have. Because if you didn't have this incompetence, why would you have received all that feedback before? April says, I don't think I even know what a neurotypical standard is. That's a great question, April. Thank you. And I think when I think of neurotypical standards, I think of people who are neurodivergent in a classroom or in a group or on a sport being compared to somebody who doesn't have ADHD or a learning disability or might be on the autism spectrum, that you should act and think like typical thinkers and do. And so you're compared to a way of being that doesn't necessarily make sense for how your brain works, and is often some kind of fictional story, because a lot of people experience this comparison. But then we think about it, there are many people who actually are neurodivergent, so many people, or people, we all have our own idiosyncrasies. So I think it's important to remember that whatever you're being compared to may not actually be what we would consider to be real. So imposter syndrome is the domain of your inner critic, as I said, and it helps you walk around with this layer of insecurity, that you're anxious that someone's going to discover the ways in which you don't measure up, or that you might be incompetent, or that you're actually sort of just, you don't really have any talents, you're barely getting by, you don't feel good about yourself. So what happens with imposter syndrome is that this critic gets in the way of you assimilating any accolades that you receive, any positive feedback that you receive. And so instead of saying, yes, I did cook a good dinner, thank you, I appreciate that, you say, oh, it wasn't that good, the chicken was a little cold, and so you sort of push it away, even though you did deserve hearing and welcoming that someone really liked your meal. April says, oh, okay, so like having a cluttered home being seen as a lazy housekeeper. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm curious, for those of you who are with us today, what ways do you feel like you don't measure up? What are some ways where you feel like, oh, you know what, I actually am not good enough in this area? Because I'd like to talk with you about that and help you figure out whether or not that's something that is an inner critic voice. And if it is, which it probably is, what you might be able to do to change how you approach that. Lynn, always finding something wrong with what you did and say that. I see. So you say that you did something, like, again, the example with dinner, like, oh, yes, the flavors were incredible, the creativity was wonderful, the presentation was lovely, but the chicken was a little cold, so the whole dinner was terrible. And I think that maybe you might say, I wish I hadn't said this, or I wish I hadn't done that. And therefore, saying this one thing is what I'm going to focus on, rather than really the entirety of our connection or our conversation or our coffee date. Let's see. Lisa says, I think like that all the time in my relationships. And Lynn says, making a quilt with a beginner and I was the one that messed it up. Okay, you made a mistake. Everybody makes those. At work, Tammy says, I feel it is easier to complete items for my coworkers than for me. Interesting. So it's easier to help someone else do their work rather than feel like you're doing your work for yourself. And Grace, I can't read your full message. I'm sorry. So if you want to send it again, please do. So what happens is that many people who live with imposter syndrome also live with a low, or maybe overt, obvious level of depression. There's this mix of persistent anxiety about the discovery of your dark secret and a hopelessness that you'll never fully be able to change for the better. How many of you who are joining us today feel like you might not ever change for the better? That this is how you are and you can't change it and you're just kind of stuck in this place. Barbara says, as I'm at retirement, feeling inadequate that I wasn't successful by standard measures. I'm curious, Barbara, what do you mean by standard measures? Do you mean how much money you earned? Or do you mean prizes that you wish you had won? I'm curious about that. Lisa says, I'm always feeling ready to feel like someone is going to tap me on the shoulder and say you're a fraud. So what would you be a fraud about, Lisa? And that's a lot of fear to carry around in your day-to-day existence. You're a fraud in what way? Because I think that these ways that you're a fraud are old voices, old parts that evolved a long time ago that probably don't serve you or reflect who you are now. I mean, Lynn, if you're trying to teach someone how to make a quilt and you make a mistake, what are they going to learn? What they're going to learn is like, wow, an experienced quilter, even an experienced quilter can make a mistake, so it's okay if I do. So you're actually giving them a gift rather than thinking, oh, they must think I'm just such, a failure as a quilt teacher or whatever you were doing. April, oh me, I feel like I'm just who I am and my struggle will always be here. Lisa Bishop, work, I see. Lynn, fraud in completing anything perfectly. Barbara, money, prestige, fame, and important accomplishments. Well, this is so interesting that you're bringing this up because what I want to say is I don't know if any of you have been listening to a podcast by Julia Louis-Dreyfus called Wiser Than Me. And I've been listening to this podcast, and I really like this podcast for a number of reasons. One is because it's fun to hear Julia Louis-Dreyfus interview people like Jane Fonda and Isabella Allende and Ruth Reichel from Gourmet and Fran Lebowitz. And it's also interesting to hear their perspectives on their lives and things that they regret or wish they had done differently. And I think what's so amazing about that is that they're saying, oh, I wasn't good at this, or I wish I hadn't done that, or, I live my life in the moment and I don't really make room for regrets, which I thought was amazing. But I really want to encourage you to if you have the time, to check it out, because I think that it's really helpful for people to be able to talk about themselves, their strengths and their challenges and their foibles, and to be okay with it. When Jane Fonda in the interview said, "I wasn't a very good mother, but I'm a much better grandmother." I mean, that took courage, right? That's incredible. And for her to say that and to say it publicly. So I think one of the things that happens, particularly for people with ADHD, is we feel like no one else is like us. Like we do these things, but no one else does them. And one of the things that's helpful in listening to this podcast for me is realizing, you know what? Everybody has their challenges and everybody has their concerns or their worries or their hardships, and they all have figured out ways of managing them and getting over them. And so I think that's something that's really important for us to learn, not only as people who live with neurodivergence, but particularly for women. And those of us here that I'm seeing in the chat are all women, so I feel okay about saying that. But hopefully in the replay there are men listening, and this is true for you too. I see, Lynn, like I'm not really a good instructor. Right. What's happening is like you have this idea that if you're a good instructor, then you don't make any mistakes. Instead of a good instructor as someone who makes mistakes and then corrects them or fixes them and then can then model for your student that's what experienced quilters do. right? I think that's such a great thing that you did. Barbara, money, prestige, fame, and important accomplishments. Right, so we can really get, with imposter syndrome, we can really get into that perfectionist compare and despair thing. Oh, I'm not doing that as well as this person. Or I don't make as much money as that person. Or this person has a bigger following on social media than I do. And that's not really the attitude that we want to take. What we want to take is, look at where I started and where I am now. Isn't that incredible that I've gotten to this part of the journey? I've learned so much and I have more to learn. Lisa says, I'm always been successful at work, but I'm not qualified. And I just think I'm not good enough, even though I succeed in everything you do. So Lisa, what tells you that you're not qualified if you're successful? Because you might be someone who learns from experience, and you clearly have, and may not be someone who actually, went to school for a certain degree or training. Jenny says, living up to standards of previous versions of myself and allowing myself to experiment and play. That is so interesting that you see that you had maybe standards, and perhaps those standards were unreasonable or unattainable, and you're giving yourself some leeway now to try some things that are different, to approach activities or tasks or jobs with a new set of glasses instead of these, perfect glasses, the glasses of perfection. You can have the glasses of sometimes, sometimes I do it well and sometimes I don't. Oh, well. April says, Lynn, I also feel that way. My husband and I own 2 businesses, and I constantly feel like someone is going to call me out for not being smart enough to be a business owner. Ouch, April. Ouch. I think I feel that way because while we are surviving, we aren't crushing the financial expectations. Sometimes we have to wonder if the expectations that we're putting on ourselves financially or otherwise are not realistic. Maybe we're expecting ourselves to get to a certain place too quickly and we're not there yet. And to remember that things take time to build. I remember when my book was published, and it took time for it to get out in the public arena and for people to discover it. And in between the time it was published and that happened, was over a couple of years. And I just had to keep telling myself, like, breathe and slow down. Not everybody comes out with a blockbuster right away. And I'm very happy with how my book's done. I'm very proud of it. And yes, there are other people like Brene Brown who can write a book and it's a bestseller in 3 seconds. That's not me. I'm Sharon. I'm doing this in my way. And I think that's important for us to remember. You are April, and you and your husband are doing it in your own way. Helen says, at work I have to contain my personality that doesn't suit the office. So Helen, is that all of your personality or just certain parts of your personality? I think that many of us with ADHD know what it feels like to be a little bit too much sometimes, or to disappear and not want to be seen. So I think it's really important to identify, well, this part of my personality, my dancing, sparkly self, really is for, when I go out with my friends, and the more the sort of more studious or focused or productive on my game part of myself is what's appropriate at work. And sometimes there can be leakage, and that's okay. If you have like a work gathering and you get a little goofy, that's not terrible. That's just showing them that you're more than one-sided. You have different aspects to yourself. One thing about imposter syndrome is that it may have origins in real experiences in your life that we might label as trauma. And your own personal history better than anyone else. And so what happens is sometimes when people treat us a certain way, we internalize that voice, and that voice becomes that critic. And it can be brutal. it can say really mean things to yourselves. Ideally, what we'd want to have is a counter to that voice, the part of yourself that you feel proud of, the part of yourself that you like, the part of yourself that can talk to you as you would talk to a 9-year-old who skinned their knee, with that kind of love and care and attention. April, my book is, Annie, could you put this up? It's called What Your ADHD Child Wishes You Knew, Working Together to Empower Kids for Success in School and Life. And I also have a card deck called the ADHD Solution Deck. I think it's really important for us to remember that we don't have to live with imposter syndrome. It can be very challenging to lower the volume on those harsh thoughts, those loud voices, and those deeply ingrained false beliefs. I'm not smart enough. I don't do enough. I'm not successful enough. Whatever the adjective is, you can put enough next to it, right? So this voice that you hear all the time, Lynn, needs a nice voice, and that voice, maybe that's my voice for you, or the voice of your own therapist or a dear friend. It doesn't have to be, your grandmother or your mother or anybody. It's your voice, right? It's the part of you that likes yourself, and it might be small and very quiet. And so we want to fertilize that, right? We want to add some fertilizer to that. I'm going to show you how. Scott says, I've been fortunate to find work where I don't have to mask. Good for you, Scott, because I think masking actually intensifies imposter syndrome and makes it worse. One of the things that can happen with these deeply ingrained false beliefs about ourselves, I'm not blah, blah, blah enough, is that it can be counterintuitive to act differently because you're so accustomed to second guessing yourself. Right? You think, maybe I didn't do this the right way, or I should redo that, or I shouldn't have said this. There's lots of shoulds that are going on, right? So what I want to offer you today is a different approach, one that allows you to value and absorb affirming things about yourself. I'm going to raise my hands here so you can see me, but I'm making a little cup with my hands to hold on to my joy. And I'm making this cup and I'm giving it to you to hold on to the things that happen in your life that are counter to that negative voice. Because there are things probably that happen and you just brush them aside instead of treasuring them in this little cup. So in this approach, it allows you to value and hold on to affirming things about yourself. What if you allowed yourself to make mistakes and consider yourself to be successful simultaneously? You make mistakes and you're successful at the same time. Does anyone do that? Let me know if you can do that. This means we're holding on to both things and we're trying to balance them, okay? Because everybody makes mistakes and everybody has some areas in life where they're doing well. Even you, Lynn, the fact that you're teaching quilting shows me that you feel that you have something to share. And that needs to go in to fertilize that little, voice that's proud of yourself, or that likes who you are. So sometimes we hit a home run, and sometimes we swing and we miss. In fact, the average baseball player strikes out at the plate 2 out of 3 times. The average baseball player strikes out at the plate 2 out of 3 times. Not once, but twice. What does that tell you about how people are naturally imperfect? Trying, struggling, regrouping, and trying again does not mean that you failed or you're a fraud. It doesn't mean that other people are better than you are. It's about shifting your own mindset from a fixed mindset. I am who I am, it's not going to change, and the other negative things, to a growth mindset. I'm living and I'm learning. I'm going to stumble, that's okay. I'll pick myself up and figure out what the next step is. April says, I'm okay with my mistakes in private, but once my mistake is known by anyone else, the balance shifts. And why do you think that is, April? I'm going to guess that it's the shame factor, that you can handle it yourself, but if someone else knows it, then they're going to be judging you and criticizing you, and you get reduced to probably your 6-year-old version of yourself who might have been yelled at by the teacher for, maybe spacing out or or interrupting too much, or moving around in your chair. Lynn, my daughter saw the messed up quilt and she came up with a fix immediately. I would love to be able to do that as well. Well, here's the thing. The fact that your daughter saw the quilt and fixed it, fantastic. Fantastic. You showed it to her and you didn't collapse. Barbara, yes, because of so much experience, I'm the best at fixing mistakes. Great. April, yes, that's exactly it. Okay. Lynn, shame is the worst thing when you get it all the time. So here's the thing. People can shame you and you can shame yourself. If someone does something that's blaming, you can either take that on or say, that sounds like blame to me. Can you say that in a different way? Or, that sounds like blame to me. I'm feeling flooded. I'm going to take some time apart. I'll be back in 15 minutes. We can control how we transform what someone says to us and whether we make it a shaming statement or we don't. Barbara, I always feel better after I admit my mistake to someone. It diffuses the shame and lets me move forward. Yes, because you're being accountable. You're not pretending that you're something different. You're being who you are. And that is a relief for yourself, for your psyche, for your soul, and for the other person. That's fantastic. Imposter syndrome denies you the satisfaction derived from efforting, from that word that I use in my book that I've created, from trying. It's more than trying. It's like a full body effort. Your mind, your body, your emotions, everything's working together to attempt something, versus trying, which can be like a toss off, right? And you're engaged, okay? So when you focus on when you live with imposter syndrome, instead of sort of deriving natural satisfaction from the efforting process and engaging in something, there's a dismissal, there's a minimization, there's an invalidation of what you're doing. You actually have strengths and challenges just like everybody else. And instead of throwing them away, we've got to learn as neurodivergent people to hold on to our successes long enough for them to take root in our brains, in our memory, so that we can fertilize that part of our brain, that smart Sharon, that creative Lynn, that accomplished April, I'm using all my alliteration today, whatever you'd want, that beautiful Barbara, etc. If I didn't get your name, I'm sorry. So Lynn says, I now do fear effort in the quilt making because I've had a failure. No, that is not a failure, Lynn, and that's a fixed mindset. And if you don't know the difference between fixed and growth mindsets, I encourage you to look it up. That fixed mindset is telling you had a failure. A growth mindset would say, oops, that was not a great choice. I made a mistake. On what can I learn from that mistake, incorporate, and move forward with. That is the beauty of a growth mindset. And that is what I want you to take with you as one of your tools to combat that feeling of being a fraud. So how are we going to hold on to our successes, however small or big they are, long enough for them to take root in our memory, and so that we can fertilize that part of ourselves that is that cheerleader, that ally, the part of ourselves that we like, and we want to lean into. Those parts of ourselves nurture our inner sense of pride. And pride is the antidote to imposter syndrome. You feel proud about something you've done. You're not going to feel like you're a faker, right? So here are some how-tos. 1, acknowledge your wins. Regardless of the size or the importance, shift your perspective from what's wrong to celebrating what is positive and good enough. If someone pays you a compliment, accept it. Don't deflect it. Say thank you and hold it like the precious gift that it is. If you tell a colleague that you're trying to improve your timeliness and you show up to a meeting on time, receive their high five of support with a grin. When your partner appreciates that you went grocery shopping and put all the food away, take it. Please write in the chat a win that you've had this week. Number 2, counter the voice of the inner critic by strengthening your inner ally. This coach is the one who encourages you, who reminds you of your value as a person, who sees the good things in you. It's the part of yourself that you like the most, small or big. Strengthen this ally by paying attention to what is working. Most of us spend most of our attention paying attention to what is not working. I am asking you to try to pay attention to what is working, okay? At the end of each day, with a partner or a friend or a relative or your journal, acknowledge 3 things that went well. These can be as simple as, I made a great cup of coffee this morning, to my boss told me she loved my presentation. Fill up that cup inside of you with these statements instead of the self-critical, judgmental ones. You'll be building self-confidence and self-worth instead of fueling anxiety, a sort of self-defeating language and attitude as well. You know, a lot of us have an approval cup that we hold out to other people. Could you put some water in this? Could you put some water in this? Could you put some water in this? Our approval cup is like the little cupped hands I showed you earlier. What are you going to put in your own approval cup? Because that is what nurtures your pride and is the antidote to feeling like you're a fraud. Thirdly, I would like you to validate the traits about yourself that are separate from what you do. Who you are is not what you do. These are words like I'm warm, funny, smart, spontaneous, generous, kind. People with ADHD struggle to perform effectively in certain areas related to executive functioning skills. Emotional regulation, organization, time management, and focus. But you also excel at activities and interests that you love. You pursue them, you do them. Both are true simultaneously. There's a lot right with you, so take the time to notice, honor, and hold on to those things today. This reduces that reflexive and toxic shame. I messed up. Oh my God, I'm a fraud. Oh, I'm an imposter. Oh wait, no, I'm just human. I was speaking too quickly and my words came out a little bit funny. It's okay, right? It's okay with you. It's okay with me. What we want to do is, by taking the time to notice what's right with us, even in really small things, we're reducing that reflexive and toxic shame and those patterns that we carry around that tell us what's not right with us and what we didn't do well. Okay? So let's see. Let's see. Elisa says, I went to a new agency job and decided I would just be really quiet and not really talkative, as I felt it would be easier to be the quiet than the normally chatty person I am. So for weeks I had to keep that mask on. Oh, Lisa, that sounds really difficult. Barbara, my assistant keeps all of the thank you notes from clients so I can look back at them when I'm discouraged. Oh, I love this. That's great. April, I was taught not to celebrate any part of myself because it's vain. Actually, it's healthy. While I know that's not healthy, there you go, I find myself rarely accepting a celebratory moment. And I'm not sure how much of this is based on raising or attributed to my ADHD, and I'm afraid I will unwillingly pass that on to my kids. So just by noticing that you do this, you're already breaking the intergenerational pattern. That's what we mean when it comes from different generations, like your parents did this to you and now you're not doing it to your kids. So when there's a celebratory moment and you notice that you're pushing it away, take a minute and take a deep breath and really say thank you. That's hard for me to take in, but I really appreciate it. I think that by taking it in little by little will make it more digestible, so to speak. So I'm curious, as we wrap up, what are some traits or some adjectives about you that are not what you do, but who you are that you really like? So for me, I would say I'm friendly and I'm generous and I'm warm. I'm a warm person. What would you say about yourself? And put that in the chat. What are some adjectives that describe you? I feel like if I accept what I've done is good, I'm bragging. I think that the likelihood of you bragging, Lisa, is so small given what I've learned about you today that you can accept what you've done good or done well without bragging. Bragging is like, oh, I'm so great, I do all these things so fantastically. That's not where you are. We're just talking about like trying to put some water in your approval cup. I don't think that's bragging. Jenny, creative, wonderful. Lisa, warm, funny, and caring, terrific. Anybody else want to share some adjectives? While I'm waiting for people to comment, I want to say that I am participating in an incredible summit that's starting today called the Executive Functioning Online Summit. And here is my the way that you can access this summit through my Thrive cart. This is a summit that's run by Seth Perler. He's an incredible executive functioning skills expert and coach, and it's fantastic. So I really encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about executive functioning skills and how to improve them, check it out. Tammy, let's say I'm creative, humorous, and compassionate. April, you're honest. Helen, you're smart and funny. When I admit my oops with clients, they laugh and love it. They take it as that is okay because there is no perfection. Oh, I want to say yes, yes. On that note, I think we should end for today. That's a beautiful comment. I'm just going to read it again. When I admit my oops with clients, they laugh and love it. They take that as okay because there is no perfection. Fantastic. Thank you all so much, everybody, for joining. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you have a beautiful weekend. We'll be back here in 2 weeks, and I'll see you then.